social center right now. But we also should be polite with our guests. And so let me introduce our guest for today, Elisabeth Ivarsflaten. So how do I introduce our guest? So I wanted to kind of give the essence of what I think you are about, and here's the story to that. Imagine the following situation. You are a university, and you want to build up something at your university. You want to make it visible. You want to enhance its image. You want to create some reach out of the social science community. And you ask your social science faculty to come up with ideas, and other faculty as well. Well, then you got Elisabeth on the other side, receiving this message. And what she does is she takes this request, she turns it around, she talks around the world with people who have experiences with creating new facilities. She collects ideas. She applies for funding, and what comes out is actually one of the most interesting facilities that we have at the moment for online panels and survey research, the so-called Digital Social Science Core Facility. And so she has brought this all about, and it's a real interdisciplinary effort where they bring together interdisciplinary research to do through this facility. And I find this is an amazing example and setting really a good example for us that we are such an interdisciplinary community as well of what we could potentially establish with lots of work, I heard. So we will definitely follow your ideas and experiences here. Elisabeth is also, of course, the coordinator of the Norwegian Citizen Panel, and we have maybe had contact with that panel in various research articles already. Elisabeth is a professor at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen. And she, as you probably all know, she works on public opinion, political parties, and she has focused a lot on interest that is also very prevalent at the center at the radical extreme right parties and also social movements related to it. And her research has appeared in very important journals in the AJPS, Comparative Political Studies, and the European Journal of Political Research. And just to give you some headlines, if you're not as familiar, but a lot of us, of course, know her work: what unites the right-wing populists in Europe, why women avoid the radical right, how the anti-prejudice norm affects policy and party preferences, and the anti-racism norm in Western European immigration politics, just to give you some examples. But she works on lots of other projects as well, on hate speech or less hate speech, I guess, on linguistic representations of climate change discourse, also very interesting for us, on Muslim inclusion in Western European societies, and sexual reproductive rights, just to name a few extra ones. So today, Professor Ivarsflaten is going to present on a special project that she has conducted, I assume, with that facility and with the Norwegian sample there, Asylum Centers in the Neighborhood, Causal Effects of Sudden Influx on Exclusionary Attitudes. So let's welcome Elisabeth to our CSDC.
Thank you very much, Deacon, and thank you all for inviting me here and for coming. As I stand between you and your Friday night drinks in the sunshine, I realize I better have something really important to say, and I do. I came all the way from Norway because I wanted to share with you what I have to say today, and also because I wanted to facilitate collaboration between this initiative that was so generously described here, between us and between you, because I think you do a tremendous job here of working more closely, both locally and nationally in Canada, and then also branching out and working comparatively. And for me, that's a model. I think that's exactly how I want to work. I want to know the details, the nitty-gritty details of how politics gets played out in the local community. And one needs to understand the political context and a comparative perspective for that. So what I'm going to do today, and you'll be seeing I have some papers here in my book, we can The thing is, I'm going to give a talk that I've not given before, exactly in this way. And it's based, so this title is based on one paper, but I'm going to be presenting two papers. And none of them are published yet. So they're in various stages. So this particular paper is an island of ours revised resubmit whole bonanza. But the other paper I'll be presenting is about to be submitted. So comments, everything you say can be taken into account by me at this stage for these. And then I'm going to present something which is just new data that we collected in November of last year and that we just analyzed. And I don't know yet what that data means. I mean, I know what we thought about it, I know what the results say. But what the data mean just yet, I'm not exactly sure, but I have some ideas and I'm going to share them with you. I'm going to open up for discussion around those things. And I have about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit more, but we're going to finish roughly on time. And then you can ask questions. And if you feel like you need to ask questions while I go, please do so. I'm going to start in a little bit of an unusual place. And luckily for me, it's exactly the place where it started. So I'm going to start talking about where the data comes from before I get into the substance and the theoretical perspectives and the empirical findings. And the reason, of course, is that I'm quite proud of where the data comes from. And I wanted to make sure it's a very significant part of the story that I want to convey today. So just to give you like a sense, I created this collage that some of you saw it yesterday. So in 2015, we received a pile of money to create a social science infrastructure. And the reason why it's called its core facility is that that's what they have in the medical sciences, and they wasn't awarding money for that sort of stuff. So I just decided to call it that, although it's a little alien to our discipline. So what this is, it's a citizen lab, which we opened in December 2016 over there, 32 computers, where economists and social psychologists and political scientists do various experimental work, and we use it for teaching. So this isn't teaching mode, if somebody is teaching some statistical program. And then we have these various places where we meet, just like this, to have celebrate some achievement, or to have intellectual discussions and lunch seminars that we have every Tuesday. There's a bunch of publications coming out of the stuff that we do. We do a lot of outreach, like this is an example of an app that we did with a local newspaper where we presented some of the data we had collected in an interactive fashion. And then the flagship of what we do is the Norwegian Citizen Panel so far. The Norwegian Citizen Panel, we started back in November 2013. And it's a simple random sample drawn from the National Population Register of Norway. So that's a real advantage that we have in Norway, is that we can draw samples from an almost perfect sampling frame of the adult population in Norway. We've now collected 14 waves on the panel. We've replenished it as time has gone by, but we do have quite a significant number of people who stayed in for all those 14 rounds of data collection. And the last one we just completed and received the data completed in January. This panel is based on a time-sharing model, which is invented by Diana Matz and her colleagues. And we use it, we have 6 different thematic units that use this model, this panel, and we have 15 different research projects that we pay for data collection in the panel right now. And there are more than 50 researchers who are getting data from the panel this year. So it's a quite large operation. The reason we don't bother people so long, so we ask the question for about 15 minutes. But we use randomization very aggressively, both to learn, but also to maximize test efficiency. So the work that I'm going to be presenting today, I've not done only myself. We have this thematic research unit on migration, diversity, and extremism. And so the work that I will be presenting is I've done with the social psychologist, and the sociologist, Susanne Bygnes, who works mainly with qualitative data, and I will present some of that, and Stefan Dahlberg, who is a political scientist like me. I will also, the other paper I'll be presenting is also something I'm working on with a PhD candidate, Åsta Nole, at the University of Bergen. But here's the reason why I'm telling you this story about the data. You know, when you create a panel, one of the things you hope for is that something will happen so that you get an opportunity to study how public opinion reacts to that. And because the thing is, whenever something happens, this is when we apply for money, and then we, after the fact, ask all the questions. And then we kick our leg because we wish we had the pre-event baseline. So, right? So, of course, but the problem with unexpected events, so reforms is one thing, and Scotland's and others have done great jobs in predicting things that will happen and then planning things. But with unexpected events, the problem is they're unexpected. You don't know that they're going to happen. So how do you plan for that? And the truth of the matter is you can't. And none of us thought that the refugee crisis would happen. But for my thematic unit, for all of its dire human consequences, what's become known as the refugee crisis was a real research opportunity. Because we had collected data before the influx of refugees to Norway many times, and then we collected data during the influx of refugees and after the situation had been brought under control many times. And so we have some people exiting and entering the panel, and so we have to think of methodological ways to deal with that. But we also have a substantial number of people staying in. And then there's something about a local twist and how the asylum centers were distributed across the country, which I will also get to, which makes the story even richer. You probably can't see in the back these numbers, but what I want to point out, so now we're going to go into where we're going to actually talk about the refugee crisis now. Some don't like that I say there was a refugee crisis in 2015 and it ended. And it's important to say that, of course, from the point of view of the refugees themselves, or from people fleeing from war in Syria or Afghanistan, the refugee situation is by no means over. From the point of view of Turkey, from the point of view of Greece, from the point of view of Spain, as recipient countries, the refugee crisis is by no means over. But what I think this graph of these red lines showing the number of asylum applications per month, what they show you is that from the point of view of the recipient population in Norway, there was a discrete event. There was a refugee crisis that had an end from the perspective of Norway. So this is what I will mean when I say the refugee crisis in 2015. As you see, it was very concentrated in the fall of 2015, the arrivals. But this didn't only happen in Norway. The refugee crisis of 2015, the influx of refugees in 2015, was, by UNHCR estimates, a little over 1 million asylum seekers and refugees that came to Europe during that year, and most of them came in the fall. And it created an unprecedented situation, one of great strain for the EU, where basically shared borders and collaboration that had been evolving over a number of decades basically failed and borders closed down. So it was a tremendous humanitarian catastrophe, and there was lots of suffering, and there was a breakdown of political structures around it. What was the situation of Norway in this? Well, so you're here in Montreal, so you will know this being far north. So this happened in the fall and winter of 2015. And Norway received 31,000 asylum claims during this period. That's not a great deal on the European scale, but it is Norway is a small country by population, so 5.2 million people live there in total. So that means that when you do the relative numbers, like how many asylum claims per recipient population, Norway was by some measures third, by other measures fourth in the number received. So Germany, of course, and Sweden received many more refugees than Norway did. Sweden received more than 100,000, and Germany a lot more than that. But in part because Sweden closed its borders, and Norway received more refugees than other countries did, because there were lots of refugees trying to get to Sweden. who then had to divert and go to Norway. So this was the main route through which refugees came to Norway. But that's not what's on this picture. So what happened during and created a specific special political situation in Norway was that Norway actually has a Schengen border. Many people, me included, had not really ever thought very much about that Schengen border. So Norway has a border with Russia. So Norway is part of Schengen, not part of the EU, part of Schengen is part of lots of EU things. So, and Norway has a border with Russia. And this is a Schengen border is important in the refugee crisis and in the EU system, because that makes Norway a potential first country. So under the Dublin Agreement, asylum seekers have the right to have their their asylum application treated in the country where they first enter. So what a lot of countries in the north do is that they return asylum applicants who entered in Greece or Italy to Greece or Italy, which is a deeply unsolidaric thing to do, but it's still done. So what Norway realizes at this point in time is that we're a first country. It's possible to win. The refugees realized it before Norway realized it. Countries in Europe are closing down their borders. People in a desperate situation are trying to find a place to go and to enter Europe. And they use social media to find various ways to find a way into Europe. And somebody discovers that it's possible to cross into Norway through the very far north from Russia. Because of a peculiar regulation between Norway and Russia, it's not allowed to cross that border on foot. So you can only do it on something that has wheels. So this created a situation whereby 5,000 asylum seekers entered in the freezing cold of the north of Norway from Russia on bikes that they managed to get hold of on that. So, and this created a political panic larger than would otherwise be seen, I think, based on the numbers alone, because one perceived oneself as being in a position of potentially receiving a much larger number of refugees through this route. Lots can be said about this, and lots has been said about this, and I know you've had some very interesting people here to talk to you about it. What I'm going to focus on today is how the public in Norway reacted to what happened to this influx of refugees. And I'm going to start then by turning to our literature and ask, what kind of attitudinal reaction would we expect in a recipient population when you have a sudden influx of refugees in a situation where that appears out of control with the government? So we did a pretty thorough literature review here and literature search, not only in political science, but in social psychology and sociology as well. And of course, there are gazillions of studies, as you all know, about various variables and how intergroup relations are affected by levels and changes in diversity. But finding a specific study that studies the sudden influx of refugees and the reactions to that, like a specific design exactly like this, was harder for us to find empirically. That's not to say that it has been theorized. I won't bore you with all the details of contact and threat theory because you've heard them over and over again, but it's at least fair to say that these are the dominant theoretical perspectives through which we tend to discuss and debate reactions to changes in levels of immigration or diversity. And to cut a very, very long story short, I think that in this particular context, these two theories, however different they otherwise are, do not actually yield different predictions. Because in the short run, even contact theory opens up for the idea that there will be an exclusionary response initially that then will develop and evolve into more beneficial, mutually inclusive relations later on. I would go so far as to say when you think about the broad national reaction, which is going to be the first part of the talk, the theoretical expectation based on anything that I was able to find or read was that initially in the short run, there wouldn't be an exclusionary reaction. What we saw on the ground was mixed. So in terms of, so one thing is what sorts of reactions you perceive in opinion data, but another thing is what goes on in activism and on the streets. These things are sometimes connected and not always. So what we saw was a mixed response. We saw a response that emphasized, we saw a growth in refugees welcome organizations, for example. Had this wonderful, Refugees Welcome had this wonderful way of choosing a name for their activism where you could add on Refugees Welcome and then your country or your village or your city. So you had all these organizations called Refugees Welcome Europe, or Refugees Welcome Norway, Refugees Welcome Germany, Refugees Welcome Bergen. We had Refugees Welcome Landos, which is a little tiny part of Bergen. So there were all these little initiatives that showed up during that, which emphasized the obligation to help and the need for help for the refugees. And then we had the opposite reaction. So this is a picture taken right outside of my city, Bergen. A week or so before a group of asylum seekers was supposed to come and settle in this house, and this was supposed to become an asylum center. It had used to be was a bed and breakfast, small bed and breakfast, and they won. We'll talk more about this. They won the procurement competition to be able to host refugees in that house. And then right-wing extremists, actually, it turns out, right-wing extremists from Poland who happened to live and work in this area in this particular time lit the house on fire as a protest against having refugees settled in that particular neighborhood. And we saw this not only in Norway, we saw it in Sweden, Germany, and in many other places. So to say that the response was mixed is to put it very, very mildly. And actually the project that this paper on local reactions is involved with actually does do the job of the sort of qualitative exercise of going and talking to the refugees, talking to the local populations, and talking to the people who own the refugee facilities and so forth. So although I here focus on public opinion, we do have a richer intake to empirically to what we're saying. But then let's go back to the public opinion. And so here comes this paper. Now I'm inserting a paper, which is not the one about the asylum centers, but which is one about the general reaction in the public. So I think while the direction of change, so the change in the recipient population's views about immigration should be expected to be exclusionary, and I don't think there's very much doubt about that initially. The scope of that change, I think, is very unsettled in the literature. So I can't go and read the literature and make a decision that this is what we're going to expect. And so here I'm going to I'm going to show you the direction of change, but I am also more specifically going to focus on the scope of change in two ways. First, substantively. So this was a refugee crisis and influx of asylum seekers. Now, as we all know, there's a difference, of course, between labor migrants and refugees, and the policies that are related to these different groups are very different, both juridically, politically, and in other ways. So there is a good case to be made that what should change is attitudes related to refugee policies, asylum policies, and border control in these kinds of situations. And that what should not change are attitudes related to immigration more broadly, and these other things. You can make that claim, and there are some papers now that say there's an increasing tendency to differentiate between different categories of immigrants. And then there's another literature, one that I've contributed to that is more political psychological, and that says This may well be true, and this may be the way things ought to be, that people make these kinds of distinctions, but it's not really what happens empirically. Rather, what seems to be the case is a tendency to mix together out-groups in a very big way, and so that when a situation happens, it affects the whole set of attitudes related to immigration. So this is what we mean by the scope of the substantive scope of the reaction, substantive reach. So we're looking at whether attitudes changed directly on the refugee-related questions, or whether attitudes also changed in the broader questions relating to immigration. So that's one aspect. Another thing that we are able to look at because of this data that we have is duration. So what should we expect here? I think there are two main theoretical perspectives. And one is a general sort of public opinion perspective, and it's Bergen and Shapiro's conflict consensus theory. And the idea that they advance is that you should expect a change to endure for a while, but not forever. So there should be a reversal to baseline. So what they're saying is that they're not talking about the refugee crisis, but they're talking about crises more generally. And they're saying when a national crisis happens, a lot of other things also tend to happen. Politicians tend to come together and form unusual consensus around the government and what the government proposes. The media tends to follow up on that. And public opinion tends to then follow what that consensus is. Then this lasts for a while the crisis is being managed by the government. But then after a while, politics returns to normal, with its divisions and the media becoming critical again, and the opposition doing its job and so forth. And so with time, although they're a bit hazy on exactly how much time, public opinion should revert to baseline levels, to what it used to be before the national crisis happened. So it's possible, although we don't know at this point, whether that the refugee crisis worked exactly in this way in Norway. There's another perspective that Hans-Petter Kryse and his colleagues have been advancing in this work that they're doing on the financial crisis, that they're now expanding to also include the refugee crisis, where they're arguing that, well, sometimes what the crisis leads to is a permanent shift. It leads to like a structural change in how politics operates and which actors are important and so forth, and that creates structural change that leads to a lasting shift in public opinion. And so I would argue that if we're looking at the data, looking only at the pre-existing literature, this is sort of where we stand. We're a little bit unsettled about what the scope of that change would be. So as the Brody-Shapiro perspective draws attention to the media and the politics, I want to show you two slides about the media and political situation in Norway at the time. Should we open a window? Because it's really hot. Spring is coming, like dinner. So this is a graph of we have a media text base that covers every online, offline media content. So it just basically vacuums up the whole of everything that is being written and publicly available media in Norway. And then we put into that just a search term for refugee with a little star early enough as a word, so it can capture all the various permutations of it. And just a simple thing like that, wherever you do it, it doesn't matter. It returns a pattern somewhat like this. During the winter of 2015, the amount of media attention to stuff that had to do with refugees was enormous. We go so far, we've had students who looked at television news at this time, and this was the leading story, day out, day in, for many, many, many weeks. You really had to live under a rock in Norway not to realize that there was a refugee crisis happening. The political context. I think, I want to highlight 3 aspects of the political context in Norway. Lots more has and will be said about that. But the most important thing just to say is that politicians behaved more or less exactly as the Bergen and Shapiro theory says. So at the time, Norway had a conservative-led government, conservative-led minority government. And the minority partner in that minority-led government was the far right. And so the people who took the initiative in crafting the response to the asylum crisis, the refugee crisis, was the far right. But they didn't do, this was a typical sort of Scandinavian style consensus in that all the political parties, including the Labour Party, but excluding the Greens and the Socialist left, so the very furthest to the left parties, but including 95% of MPs at the time, signed a common agreement where new restrictions were put in place at the same time as they also allocated a significant sum of money towards establishing asylum centers and receiving the refugees. But the thing that because they didn't talk about in the media at all, the money that was being spent, what happened was the Minister of Immigration was from the populist radical right, the Progress Party, Sylvie Listhaug. She went on television and in newspapers and a big sort of publicity tour where she branded the changes that had happened as some of the making Norwegian asylum policy some of the strictest in Europe. And the logic that they were operating by was, and it was the same as you saw in Denmark, we want to have as strict policies as possible to try to persuade people to go somewhere else. Or at least to dissuade people from choosing Norway or becoming a sort of an extra attractive person. So this was the political context of what we did. So in a way, thinking about the political context, you end up in a situation where you do expect the Bergen and Shapiro hypothesis at least to hold, although it could also signal a larger shift. So turning then to the more technical details, so I know I have good survey researchers here in the room with me. These are the 2 survey items that we had asked that were directly relevant and that were well suited to the task at hand, and we have the baseline measures from before the crisis. So we had one that related directly to refugee rights. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Refugees should have the same rights to social security as Norwegians, even if they are not Norwegian citizens. This is an old item that we picked up from the National Election Study in its time, and it's before we knew about the refugee. If we'd known about the refugee crisis, we would have asked a different question. But this is what we had at the time, and this is what I think is the narrow. So at least this should be affected, right? This is, if all this theory about the exclusionary reaction is right, then this should be expected to change an exclusionary reaction. And then you have the one where you could argue both ways. You say, well, attitudes towards immigration abroad shouldn't be changed by this. This is strictly related to refugees and asylum seekers, but here's this question we had, and this also appears in the European Social Survey. In your opinion, how great an advantage or disadvantage is it for Norway that immigrants come to live here? And you will notice that both of those questions are phrased in what I call absolute terms, not relative terms, and so that makes them well suited for this sort of analysis. So now we're going to get the first results. And I'm first going to just show you a table. Oh, these are really small. But you're going to get to see the graphs. Don't worry, you're going to get to see the dynamic graphs and all. But just what we did, so we have these nice scales, but just for pedagogical purposes, because people always ask, what was the percentage change? We tried to dichotomize the variables and looked at what was the percentage change. So one interpretation of what the percentage change was. So if you look at the people who say that there should be the same social security rights for refugees as Norwegian citizens, before the refugee crisis, 44% agreed actively. So we've taken those who said neither nor. There are only zeros on this. You will see the means later, don't worry. And during the refugee crisis, that number was 36.7%. And so I don't think in this room I'll have to explain to you that that is a big drop in public opinion, although similar to a sort of a change in weather temperature, people will sometimes argue that this is a small thing, but this is significant. We have to remember this is based on a panel analysis. These are the same individuals being asked only 6 months apart. And then when you look at the immigration to Norway issue, 65% prior to the crisis thought that immigration was mainly an advantage to Norway, and that number was reduced to 52.5% during the crisis. So 6 months in between, and the only thing, or the major thing that changes is the whole situation in the refugee crisis. So I think we learned 2 things. We confirmed from this the exclusionary reaction that we had expected. So that's one thing. And we also learned that it wasn't a very narrow reaction. And so I think that's important because there's some back and forth in various papers now emerging about the refugee crisis, whether they detect or don't detect. And so finding that the scope was fairly broad in substantive terms means that it shouldn't matter so much what specific item this is, because if the reaction, if I'm right that this was the reaction and that it is also outside of Norway, then you should see it. And it shouldn't depend very much on a very specific operationalization of the question. Then I want to turn to the results on duration. So first, looking at the specific refugee crisis measure. So these are the 2 time points prior to the refugee crisis, where we actually have it also before, but we did a major new recruitment here. So we lose so many respondents if we include those numbers, but it doesn't affect the conclusion. There's a long line going here, not alone, with 2 more data points here. They're quite stable. So this is March 2015. This is October 2015. So this is at the spike. And then the situation is brought under control. And that's a fascinating thing because, as you saw, refugees stopped coming to Norway more or less already in December 2015. And those of you who read the media coverage very closely saw that there was a lag, and that the media coverage still continued to be quite high a few months later. So we asked exactly the same question of exactly the same individuals in March 2016. So the situation at that point had been brought under control, but it may not have been perceived as such. Then we asked it again a year later, in November 2016. Then the situation had been under control for almost a year, but a little less. And then in March 2017, the opinions revert to the baseline. Some 16 months later, after the situation was brought under control. So that's on the refugee item. And on the immigration item, we see a very similar pattern. So these are the 2 measures prior. This is during, this is right after, 6 months after, 12 months after, 18 months after, and 24 months after. And that's the first, this is like, yeah, you have to debate. So before we had this data point, people were like, it's not quite reverted to baseline yet until we got this data point, and now there's no discussion. It did revert to baseline. So on both measures, we see a similar dynamic. There's actually a little bit more of a lag on the immigration, a little bit bigger change, and a little bit more lag on the immigration issue. It could be related to the specific nature of it or what it asks. So I think we've learned something. We've learned that the scope of the exclusionary reaction in the recipient population was substantively far-reaching. And we've learned that it lasted for a long time. Because you have to think about all the things. So you can say, what's a long time? So the reaction and the negative reaction happened quickly, and then it lasted for a long time. So what happened during this period? And my dear colleague Robert Ford at Manchester, he hates me for saying this, but Brexit happened in this period. So one possible interpretation, now we're debating whether exactly the same patterns happened in the UK public opinion, but one possible interpretation of this data is that had not Brexit happened in this proximity to the refugee crisis, something else would have. If the timing of Brexit had been different, if it had not happened in this period of extraordinarily heated public opinion, Brexit would not have happened. So the fact that it lasted for long is important for many other things that happened. The French presidential election, the German Bundestag election, lots of other things. But then it's also important to note that we're not in a situation of a shift. We're not in a situation here of a shift that Hans-Peter Krisi and his colleagues talk about. We actually do see reversal to baseline. It's actually almost spooky how well this fits with the Bergen-Shapiro theory. And I had read it a long time ago in graduate school, and I dug it back out. Somebody reminded me of it. And I was reading it, and I was like, oh my God, it's as if though they kind of knew. They created a script for how this whole event would unfold. So I thought that was interesting. Now, so this was in Norway. So how generalizable could one imagine that this is? And what sort of spectrum of reaction are we talking about here? I would argue that when it comes to this possibility, this reversal to a baseline, I'm not exactly sure that you would see that in every other country. And here's the reason. So when Hans-Peter Krisi and his team discuss the reaction to the financial crisis, they find very different patterns in the south of Europe and in the north of Europe. In the south of Europe, you have a structural change. You have new political parties being formed, and you have a complete sort of reversal of how politics is conducted. In Norway, because we had a far-right party from before, this issue was very heavily mobilized. So the baseline we're starting from is one where the immigration issue is already on the agenda. It's manifest as a political party, the opposition is mobilized, and so forth. It's possible that in the places where the reaction in public opinion among politicians created a different kind of dynamic, a different kind of structural shift that lasted longer institutionally, such as Brexit, or such as the establishment or at least the institutionalization of AfD as a force in politics, as we saw in Germany. It's possible that the shift would be more long-lasting. It's a question that I throw out there. So that's what I wanted to say about the national election. Now I want to turn to the local level. Because the recipient population in Norway experienced the refugee crisis in two different ways, at least in two different ways. First, as what we've talked about, as a national event through the leadership of politicians and mediated by media. A lot of people never saw a refugee during the refugee crisis, but only on television, not in the flesh. So, but some experienced the refugee crisis as a local issue. As refugees actually arrived and settled in their neighborhoods. So that's a very different experience than the one that is mediated through the media. And in fact, what we see, and this is what I was saying is the other, for research purposes, advantageous part of how the refugee crisis unfolded in Norway. Because the number of refugees arriving to Norway have been fairly low and very stable for a very long period of time, there was no capacity to receive all these refugees in existing asylum centers. And because it was the winter, and because benefits to refugees in Norway is tied to being in a refugee center, not because they're detention centers, but because there are lots of reasons for refugees to live there. Nearly all refugees who come to Norway apply for asylum. They live in these asylum centers for the first. Some live there for a very long time, but in the initial period. So this dark line here is the number of refugee centers, new refugee centers being established. So coinciding with the arrivals, you have this massive establishment of new asylum centers. In total, in this period, 257 new centers are established. And so we're asking ourselves, what will happen to those who experience the asylum centers in their local neighborhoods compared to those who do not. And again, we go search for the literature to find out what to expect based on what we already know. And there are some really good contributions here in our literature, but it's not something that we've studied a lot. It's something I think, and I'll make the case for you today, we should study a lot more. Because what we found, so we found on the one hand, Hopkins, APSR article, where he says local communities become these politicized places. So you receive refugees through an interpretive framework, which is interpretive framework being the national rhetoric that is going on. So the interpretive framework in Norway would be negative. This is a problem, it's dangerous, there's a threat. And so the idea would be that those communities that experience the refugee crisis in their local communities would be particularly negatively affected. They could even drive that negative exclusionary reaction that we saw. Then there's another set of studies which are really interesting by Cara Wong and various co-authors, where she uses this well-known survey research shorthand with the little and the big pictures in people's head, but she uses to refer to the difference between people's perception of local diversity locally and nationally. And one of the things she finds is that people have more accurate perceptions of the extent of diversity locally than they do nationally. And so she advances this theory which says that people get their information about local matters from a completely different source than they get about nationally. So national ideas about diversity are based on mediated debates, political leadership, national level discussions, whereas local ideas are based on more experiential and more concrete social networks. So because the refugees who came to, this is Norway, because the refugees who came to Norway entered from Sweden and from far up north, what happened in Norway, and because we have a centralized, organized government that decides a lot of things and has a lot of money to follow up their decisions, the asylum centers were actually established throughout the country. So it's not a case of where they were established just at the border where the refugees arrived. They would actually they would hold these public procurement competitions under strict rules, and where everybody, various organizations, various private people who owned hotels and needed something to fill up the winter season to earn some money, and various other initiatives that could apply and say, we want to have an asylum center where we live. And it was not a coordinated, but it happened quickly, and it's a business. So it's not as if though this was in any way, and I'll show you the data, correlated with the local willingness to have asylum centers. So it was a chaotic process, but it wasn't driven centrally or politicized in the way that the politicians could decide not to put centers where they, in their regions or whatever. It was mainly bureaucratically driven, and they reported not having had time to consider anything other than, can I manage? And also, are we choosing the cheapest offer, the one that best fits the contract criteria and so forth. So what this results in, we argue, is a situation where we have I hesitate to use the word, but it's very near to a natural experiment. You have a set of people living in local communities that received a center, and a set of people who lived in local communities that didn't receive a center. And we are able, because we have baseline data on these people before the centers came, we're able to say that there were no significant differences between them attitudinally and on very few socio-demographic variables before the settlement or before the asylum centers. So yeah, So this is, there is a large appendix where we do a lot of balance analysis, looking at things like placement on the political left-right scale, measured before in March 2015. So before anybody knew that they would have a center in their local communities. And so we have what we call a control group that had no asylum centers, and a treatment group that got a new asylum center during this period. And we measure their left-right self-placement and find no significant difference. We measure their satisfaction with the current government and find no significant difference. We measure their perception of the current economic situation and find no significant difference. We measure their views on immigration before as an advantage or disadvantage to Norway and find no significant difference. And we measure their views on how salient, how important immigration is as an issue, and we find no significant difference. So these groups were very similar in their attitudinal We do the same with socio-demographic variables. The number of men and women, quite similar. We find a little bit of an age effect, which we then control for in a statistical analysis. And we find that the results that I'm going to show you in a minute are robust to this change. We find no significant difference related to educational levels. There is one issue with geography. So urban areas tended to have fewer asylum centers because it was more expensive. The bids that were put into the urban areas were more expensive. So there was a slight favor, a slight sort of leaning in the rural areas. We also control for this, and so the results that I'm going to show you are robust to that. So the first thing we do is we look at this immigration advantage disadvantage question, and we wonder, is the difference that we observe, the exclusion of the growth in exclusionary attitudes, is it driven by those who experience the center in their neighborhood? So we have both self-reported and objective information on that. I'm going to show you the self-reported information because it's bigger data, but it also holds up for the where when we use the what we call the objective information. We can do questions about that later. And this is one graph. There's a whole regression. This is a panel analysis. This is a year before the crisis, 6 months before the crisis. This is during and directly after. And there's no difference in the reaction. So the negative reaction is not driven by the establishment of the asylum center. And whatever we gathered these dots to have more data on each side to see if that would give us any better results. And not really, really not. We're not able to say that these things are neither statistically nor substantively different from each other. But we do find one difference, and that's what I'm going to show you now, and that we find incredibly fascinating. So we asked the people who have received a center in their neighborhood whether they think it's okay to have a center there. And then we ask the people who have not had a center whether they think it would be okay to have a center there. And what we find there is what we would describe as a big acceptance reaction. So this is then in March. So this is close, very near to when the asylum center had been established. And we find that of those who had experienced having the new asylum center in their neighborhood, it had been established in most cases just the month before or a couple of months before, 60% say it's okay. Of those who have not experienced it, only 43% say it's okay. So we would argue that had not these people experienced the center, that number would have been like that. Because the only difference that we know of, or we know a couple of more differences, but we also, when we control for those other differences, these numbers stay as they are. Yeah.
Is the question exactly the same for the?
So there is a difference because we ask, do you think it's okay to have an asylum center in your neighborhood, or do you think it's okay to get an asylum center in your neighborhood? Because in the one case they have it, and the other case they don't have it.
So they get different questions.
So there's a difference on that. And in Norwegian, it's It's even it's a tinier difference, but that is the difference. Yeah. So, and it is a different question. It is a question about having or getting. So we think that we here have made what we call discovery, something that we did not necessarily expect before we started. We find that attitudes to immigration at the local level, these attitudes towards the asylum centers in the neighborhood, and at the national level, they diverge sharply. So at the national level, you see this exclusionary reaction, but at the local level, you see an acceptance reaction. And we ask ourselves, how should we understand this? So we think, and I'm going to show you some more data that is going to, those of you who have a hard time believing that this data is true, I'm going to persuade you even some more. What we think is going on is that citizens in local communities update their information in accordance with what Wong suggested. So they take in the local experience and they apply local information to process what is going on with this asylum center in their neighborhood. Those who don't have it, they only rely on the mediated national discourses. So they use the same source of information for thinking about immigration nationally and thinking about what it would be like to have an asylum center in their neighborhood. So we think that the local communities that did not experience a center, they behave like politicized cases. For them, the national discourse really frames how they think about getting an asylum center. But for those who have experienced it, it's as if though those same pressures don't apply to that question. So it still applies to the question of immigration to the country, but doesn't seem to apply to the question of whether it's okay to have the asylum center in your neighborhood. So it's exactly like Wong has suggested. For those with local experience, it appears that the issue becomes decoupled from the national interpretation. In a way, it becomes depoliticized.
Can I ask a clarification question?
Yeah.
So when you talk about local community, how big are those? And you control for how many centers there are? If there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you might be more likely to notice. And if it's a really large land area, you might not know that at the other end of a county there is a refugee center.
Yeah. So we use both subjective, self-reported measures on do you have a center near to where you live?
Okay.
And then we go in and we have received from the immigration authorities in Norway exactly where the centers were established, and then we look at how correct the report. There's some limitations to what we can do with that, but we find that the self-reports look to us credible. But there's a discrepancy between municipality sizes and local community sizes in the even what I call the objective data that the subjective data gets out of.
So for the significant result, then it's on self-reported.
That's on the self-reported data, but it's also holds up for when we control for the other, and it's very, very similar. So I think one important aspect is that we observe this so close to when the centers were established that it's unreasonable to think that this is driven by contact in the original sense or in the sense now most commonly thought about. So we think it's more about exposure or experience than it is about these processes of contact that we also know have an effect. It's just that we don't think this is what's going on here. We have some data from the Qualitative Project to back up our interpretations and what we've seen here. Because it is true that before the centers were established, there were all these information meetings arranged in all the local communities. And there was lots and lots of opposition to having the centers there, voiced to these meetings. And that's reported in local media, and it's been observed by the researchers that attended those meetings from our group. And one of the One of the quotes that I want to bring forward today says, "At the beginning we had a public meeting. The resistance was massive. We were called to account in front of 350 people." So this is a person who has applied to have a building turned into an asylum center and then faces all this criticism. Messages poured in about rapists coming and how could we bring these people into the community. It was terrible. Some framed it as if the people would not be able to walk the streets safely anymore. And I think this quote picks up very much the mind frame of the people who are answering and have not experienced the center. Or the mind frame of the people who got the center before they got it. And then you have the other one, and so I want to sort of, before we get too enthusiastic about what these findings might mean, this quote here, I think, sort of grounds what it is that we might have found. "It has worked out well since the establishment of the Asylum Center this autumn. We hardly hear them or see them at all. The Asylum Center. When I say worked out well, I mean well compared to what people feel." So our research assistants who do the qualitative work, what they say is they describe the situations as a collective sigh of relief. So it's not as if though they have a lot of positive experiences, the absence of negative experiences. But I still think it's remarkable. It's still not a given in the theories that we have, including motivated reasoning, all that you would see these kinds of findings. So this is where I will close by showing you some recent data that we have collected. We're over time.
It's okay.
Yeah. So then we asked ourselves, so are these diverging findings at national, local, specific to these asylum center establishments, or is it something more general going on? That people tend to perceive issues related to immigration very differently when it's approached at the national level and when it's at the local level. And we do a lot of the most simple survey experiments that you could do, a split sample, where we just ask people about Norway or your local community over and over and over again, a series of questions. This is what I'm going to show you. So we ask, has something changed in Norway because of the refugee crisis? And the answer is yes, at large. And then we add the split. We ask, has something changed in your local community as a result of the refugee crisis? And this is, here we have a randomized response. And the answer in the local community is no. And we have looked at whether or not that's driven by people not having any refugees in their local communities. And it's not driven by that. And the reason is that most people have refugees in their local communities. Then we ask this question about, how do you think that the integration of refugees who settle in your local community, your municipality, or Norway will go? So it's about the optimism of integration. And here we find that there's more positive news locally, a little less positive when you think about the municipality, and the least positive when you think nationally. So, and here we do the same, asking about the amount of discussion. And we add the local community, or we add Norway. And we find that there is a lot more, there's a lot more discussion going on nationally than locally. And the final thing I'm going to show you is about the nature of that discussion. So here we find that the local discussions are perceived as calmer, less biased, more solution-oriented, and about the boring exciting, there's no difference. So as the national, the Norwegian discussions are seen as more heated, more biased, and more conflict-oriented. So we'll just, I think, end here. These new findings suggest that there is something going on, decoupling the local and the national. But there wasn't just a fluke of this experience in the asylum center, and these national attitudes vary in very different ways. And so we don't know exactly why that is, but we think that these ideas that has been suggested by Wong, suggesting that there are different ways of taking in information and learning about the national issues and the local issues, that might be what is at the bottom of these issues. But it's certainly something that we need to find out more about and we need to look more closely at the local implementation processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we open it up for questions now, and then we'll have also some drinks joining us. So do you want to field your own questions? Would you feel comfortable with that, or do you want me to do it for you?
No, we have to do that.
Okay.
I just wanted to add something. My experience, users are all academic. I'm more filled. I worked for UNHCR, worked for program Immigrant with refugees inside the camps overseas. And I don't remember, I was just thinking what was the name of the state in the United States that was in PBS News a couple of weeks ago that people, it was a Trump rally, and then they were asking, and then they were saying that refugees are coming, and we are not in our summer houses during the winter, and by summer when we go there, they're going to broke inside our houses. And that was one of the states that has nothing to do with any of the borders. There is almost close to zero refugee population in that state. And it was shows that how much fear works. And something that these days I'm so into finding out if this is the roots of the problem is more as a perspective of psychology. And that is for the past years since the Second World War, whenever organization, including UNHCR or any other Norwegian Refugee Council, Danish Refugee Council, whenever they wanted to create public awareness or create fundraising or do anything, they only show disaster. They show that they have below zero, they have nothing, and they are desperate, so we should give them money. And my understanding these days is that that has been stuck in the mind of the people. So nowadays, when we have people like Trump and Steve Bannon coming to Europe or any other citizen, or the right side, saying that these people are going to come and get your resources, it's just a matter of psychology that people accept without thinking, then versus the one who experienced and had something, realize that nothing happened to them. The level of the social service to them didn't change. Versus the nationally, when they hear it, it's just unconsciously, it clicks. I just saw a disaster. This makes true. They are telling me true. It's not lie, it's not fake, it's true news. I'm just wondering what you think about it.
I think that interpretation that you're suggesting there is fairly consistent with the data that I was just presented. And so I want to be careful with saying that there's always going to be an acceptance reaction to a refugee center. Although we're not the only study ever to have found these kinds of reactions. But what we did find is that we also asked those people who had an asylum center for much longer. And their level of acceptance was about the same as those who just recently had it. So that means that the acceptance dynamic happens very soon, and then it doesn't, at least in the Norwegian case, it doesn't seem to improve very much with time. There's like a direct effect of having that experience versus not having it. And a colleague of mine, Kim Voss, who's a sociologist at Bergen, she said, yeah, if you think about it, all the asylum centers that have been put to fire were put to fire before people came. And so there is this dynamic of where the mind travels when you're imagining the refugee versus the experience. And it's complicated, but what our study is, I think, hopeful in the sense that it does say people do take in information, really. So it's not, because you could imagine somebody who's been really against the asylum center in their neighborhood, and who then decides to only take in the information that this is a negative thing. Something happened at the store, they heard somebody else do this, and blah, blah, blah. And you could imagine that leading to a bigger hatred of the center and the people who live in the center. And I think it's interesting that we don't find that. Yeah, so we do find this change compared to those who, and we do know that a lot of people were against the center before. So, yeah.
I had a question, just a clarification question, because you did mention detention centers. So asylum, from my understanding, asylum centers are not the same as detention centers in the Norwegian context?
They're not the same, no.
Okay, and so people are out in the community regularly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's not part of the But most refugees live in them nonetheless, because they're incentivized to live there. So there are very few people who settle outside. I have a question here, one there, and then there. Yes. Oh, I need to. Yes.
So I was wondering whether you analyze whether this evolutions translate at a vote level, between the two elections, whether by leveraging the natural experiment you looked at the evolution in the vote intention and recorded vote, both at the local level, just by looking at local elections versus national elections. Because it would be interesting to see how these strategies translate into voting behavior, and especially in relation to the increasing vote for the Progress Party in regions that received the Asylum Center.
Yeah. So we don't actually find. So I don't think we will find that there was an increase in tendency to vote for the far right in the places that have the asylum centers. But I think we will find a similar increase to the one that we saw in the ones that did. So I think it's part of the national decoupling, this decoupling process where the national issues are interpreted nationally. We have lots of information to suggest that people care a lot about the immigration issue in national elections, but not in local. And so this division of where immigration is an issue is important or not. But the answer to your question is, I haven't checked, so I should check. And it's an interesting suggestion. Yeah.
Yes, so you did demonstrate the different perception at the local versus the national level. I was wondering if you had any question asking the people, asking individuals what they think about Norway receiving more refugees. For instance, whether the person who accepts having a refugee center also accept receiving more refugees in the country.
So I don't know. I don't think so, because that's one of the strange things about this, is that it doesn't appear that the local views it translates into the national. So it's a positive finding in a very limited sense. It's acceptance finding. But it's possible and it can be checked. One of the things that we are doing as a follow-up is that a lot of these people, because so few refugees that came later, a lot of these centers closed down. So now we're doing a follow-up study to see what do people think about the closing down of the centers, and are they more willing to have another one than the ones who haven't had that experience. So there's lots of little twists and turns that we can do on this, but that's it's another way to get at how far this acceptance reaction goes, if it translates into anything else, if it's still some narrow path. Yeah.
And two quick questions. The first one, when you talk about the local side of things versus the municipal versus the national, in order to deal with the integration issue, you find that people think the locality better has a more positive outlook. Did you control for other public policies? Maybe people just think that the local is better at handling things in general, as opposed to the national level, or the municipal where it could be more influenced by the mass media or whatever, and that gets us back to your sort of second story. And the second paper, about the local effect being sort of a subjective, my locality is just better, hence we deal with problems better. The second question has to do about the baseline. It's interesting in your first study, you see significant effect, and then you return to the baseline. So my question is more of a broad, where does that baseline come from? What do you think moves the baseline? Is it stable over time? So what factor can be, if crises don't influence the baseline long term, then what does? Is it generational change, or what's your take on that? That's the second question.
Those are really interesting questions. I have thought about whether the local national goes to all sorts of other issues as well. We haven't tested it yet, but I'm curious to pick your brain on like what would be good contribution. We can't do everything. We have a lot of, we can collect a lot of data, like infinite amounts, and so that would be interesting to think about. But even if it does relate also to other domains, I think it is interesting, but it works in this way for the immigration question. So, which both the optimism of the reason why we tested is because we hadn't seen anything like it before, we didn't know, but maybe you guys have, and maybe you guys haven't. That's that. What is the baseline? Yeah, I tried to talk about it, but maybe it didn't come out right. So I think the framework that Hans-Peter Krisi and his people are suggesting is probably the right one, where they're saying it depends on the political actors and the structures. So sometimes a crisis will lead to a public opinion change, but no particular change, like no new party, no new relation to the European Union, no, all these other structural changes that might happen. At other times, it completely changes the political landscape. And so it's as if those things, my department was founded by Stein Rockham, so he talks about the social privileges becoming manifest as political parties. And so I think if the crisis becomes manifest as an institutionalized in some way, the chances that it will lead to a permanent shift increases. Now, and the chances that we will see something like that, of course, increase after a crisis. So precisely because everything's in flux and these unusual dynamics happen. But I think because the immigration issue was already mobilized, there was already a party there. So that's what the baseline in Norway has kind of incorporated that issue already. Would be my.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed very much your talk and the overview of these projects. So this week I was in my graduate course, we were talking about national experiments, and we decided that the most important part of it is to look at the randomization of the as-if randomization. I think there's some people here in the course. So, and so we have looked at every article that we read about that. So I'm just wondering about the randomization of these these asylum centers. You talked a little bit about the process, but it's really hard to claim it's completely randomized. I think you try to control for it, but the attitudes you show are the national level attitudes, and they are the same. But what could be really different is the local level, right? The local level acceptance of maybe some people are more willing to engage, with local asylum seekers and others already before they have the decision made. So what can we do about that is my question. So how can you show, in a way, more evidence that that local level, what is really interesting here, it was not different to begin with? I think that's an important part of the evidence that we need to have, and maybe it can be remedied by sort of media reports about the level of discussion there was. I mean, you seem to have a very good media archive, and maybe one can automate it to look at these localities in that sense. I don't know. And then I'm wondering about the second thing about, so the wording was different, but I also wonder about whether the meaning is different when you ask about having a center, so they already have one, so you're asking them how they feel about having one. Well, they already have one. So it's a different thing to say, I'm being asked whether I accept a new center. So I'm using the wrong expression. Not a center, right? How's it called?
It's called the
Asylum. Okay, center. So also a center. Being a center.
Yeah.
So to accept a new center. It is a different question. I mean, it's not just a different question, it's a different meaning. So it needs a lot more to accept something new than to kind of confirm what I already have. So I don't know, I find these two pieces are really important for me to accept your full story, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense and it's plausible, but I would like to have more evidence of these two.
Yeah. So allocation wasn't random. So the randomization, we all know, I mean, that's a specific procedure, and it wasn't random. So the only thing we can demonstrate is that it's orthogonal to the sorts of things that you're raising. So the idea being that it wasn't allocated because the attitudes were more favorable, or because the communities were in better shape, or more welcoming, or this or that. And there we do have some good evidence on that, but we aren't. If your criterion is randomization, then we're never going to get there. Yeah, we're never going to get there. So we're debating back and forth whether to use the word natural experiment or to say, but it's clear to us that a lot of the power out of that finding comes from being able to say that the thing that was different for these people was that the one group had experienced the center and the other group had not experienced the center. Then that leads to your second question. So would it have been possible to ask a question that was exactly the same when the fundamental experience is different? So the center is there for one group and the center is not there for the other groups. That's one sort of a difficult question to
Maybe
ask.
it could be about the acceptance of refugees, was discussed earlier, the acceptance of refugees locally. Or something like that.
Right.
That can be exactly the same.
Right.
It has the same meaning.
So we also asked about various It's hard because the refugees didn't come individuals, they came to stay in the center. So and also I think we would have ended up in the same situation, right? We had some people who experienced refugee settlement and some who didn't. So I mean, I agree with you, it would be ideal, but I've also come around to the idea that the situations were fundamentally different, but that's the whole point. And so the counterfactual would be, would you have thought, without seeing the evidence, that it was plausible that people would have a strongly negative reaction to having the center there, saying that I don't think it's okay that my center is the center is here. And so, and I think that it's a plausible proposition. But yeah, it's possible that you never get out of that exercise.
So you said you had a small minority of people who thought they did not have a center, even though they lived or perceived their locality not to have a center, though they did. Is that true?
Yeah, so that's difficult. Because we know in a way where people live, in the sense that we know where they live when they join the panel. But they could have moved. And so it's hard to, we don't geotag any people, and so that would be, and we could do, we talk in the language of like this is a plausible, these are probable, like that, and what we find is that people who say that they have an asylum center tend to live in a municipality that receives an asylum center. And people who don't say that they receive an asylum center tend to live in municipalities that did receive an asylum center. And then we find that there are a lot of people who say that they don't have an asylum center in their neighborhood, but still live in a municipality that has an asylum center. And that I think is a plausible thing because a neighborhood is a different unit than a municipality. And so, so there are some discrepancies with what we're able to get at objectively because we haven't geotagged our.
Can you enlighten me on the divisions in Norway, municipality and rural area? Is kind of considered municipality as well, or?
Yeah. So Norway right now has 423 municipalities. Going to be much fewer very soon because it's big municipal reforms. And we're going to use the citizen panel to study. But it's and they vary tremendously in size, both in terms of population and in terms of area. So it's there are many neighborhoods within the municipality. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to for Deepan's question, whether the people who were perceiving the people who had gotten a question about having one, but had said that they didn't have one, whether that would be a way of getting at that, whether the question framing itself had an effect on their attitudes.
Yeah, possibly, but although I don't think we have that. I don't think the data we have is much higher. It's an interesting situation.
Any other questions? Oh yeah.
So, two questions. First one, think about exactly what the national treatment is. And so my sort of understanding of it is that the treatment is that the influx of immigrants, the message from the government that will be strict. And on top of this, it seems that all these new facilities are being built in a very efficient way and very quickly. This seems to be a huge success.
Yeah, they are being built. They're being procured too. So they're existing buildings.
They're always existing.
Yes, always
Okay.
existing.
But all of this is being done very efficiently and quickly, and no scandal, nothing else. So there are very different pieces of news going on. So there is influx.
Yes.
A government saying we'll be strict. So this will not stay, and then on top of this, everything is going well. And so this combination of these three things that was impact your measure.
Possibly, although I would argue that the situation didn't appear to be under control, and there is this notion of Norway being a very small country in the big world of Europe, and not being able to set its standards all on its own is very sort of present. So I wouldn't say that there's this reaction that everything is sorted out, the government is taking care of us. But where are you going? Are you saying that the reversal to baseline is more because of that, or?
I suppose that if the government had said publicly we'll be strict.
Right.
Probably would not have been universal. Is that a fine, first argument?
I don't know.
Second question. That's okay. And I will talk about the church. And I'd like to move it on the church. First, is the church among the few groups that were very favorable to the immigrants, or not?
It wasn't the only organization, but
But they
yeah,
were
they were also they weren't very vocal at the time, but yeah. But they are favorable.
They are favorable, and so is any difference in reaction to, I guess, church members? Is the decline the same?
Right. So it's church membership different in the various municipalities.
No.
No.
Nationally, are the church members, I
More
guess, not reacting at all? Perhaps?
So we have a very watered down church membership in Norway. So if you don't make an active, if parents don't make an active effort to make sure their kids are not part of the Norwegian church, they become part of the Norwegian church. So that means that the church membership doesn't explain anything. But whether you actually are, go to church and do those things, that explains quite a few things. And there are more favorable views. And there's an interesting division. There is an interesting division between the free churches, the evangelicals, if you wish, and the what used to be the state church, but is now its own thing, not run by the state anymore, but the main Protestant church in Norway. So the free churches, both on the leadership level and the membership level, are less favorable towards immigrants and typically people who will consider voting for the far right. And the people who are ordinary members of the state church are not. And we just had this incredible political drama this fall in Norway about the Christian Democrats, a tiny party that decided to join the government with the conservatives and the far right. And they were split down the middle, almost like as split as it's possible to be. 50% of the counties, 50% of the delegates, 50% of the voters just wanted this way or that way. And so then they have always managed this division by being a bit sort of neither here nor there. But now they decide to make a decision. And so it's going to be interesting to see if they survive as a party because of that decision. Yes, please.
So I was just wondering about some of the comparative potentials here, and from the perspective of Hungary, where talked about tectonic shifts, but even though the migrant crisis was utilized on a national level as the catalysis for already underlying dismantlings of democratic structures and safeguards, it wasn't the migrant crisis that causes the tectonic shift. It's an underlying political current that existed, even though we didn't have a migration agenda type party, but. Anyway, so one of my questions, what I'm wondering is whether the whole decoupling has a potential that the local is able to go through this decoupling experience, to take itself off a little bit of the national discourse. Whether that's not also a facet of a healthier democratic environment where the press eventually, but where you have this curve of crisis, peak attention, peak propaganda, peak whatever, and then trickle down and go back into baseline type of situation, as opposed to in other cases where the line between the national and the local has been blurred so much, and there's such a dependency that on the very local levels, these spheres of interaction, these spheres of social discourse, localized social discourse, are narrower and narrower. It's a less healthy, decentralized democratic situation, and therefore the national and the local become so enmeshed that local communities have a hard time going through this decoupling process. And just in terms of Hungary, I mean, in the local discourse, through a local robbery situation, you will still hear people in the villages and so on saying, on top of everything else, we have these migrants. We don't have migrants. But that became the part of our nomenclature. So we've gone to the level where the kindergarten kids are calling each other's migrants as slurs. So we went from the gypsy to the migrant, which in local context really means something, sadly. So I'm wondering going forward whether it's the same scenarios, isolated small nations in Europe worried about constant invasions and being at the mercy of bigger powers. There's some similarities between the two realms, but whether this process of the national and the local based on experiences isn't also one of the controlling factors is a more healthy democratic division of government, press, public. And a less healthy democratic situation. I know that you didn't control for that, but I'm wondering going forward whether it's also not a more process.
It's a really interesting proposition, and it suggests some really interesting avenues for comparative work. I think it's not entirely impossible. The local government is a vibrant thing in Scandinavia, and the welfare state is administered locally. So if local politicians don't tax a lot, don't have the power to tax a lot, but they have a lot of power over the actual provision of public sector services. So it's possible. It's possible.
So, there's no other question, or is there? Okay, I think we are all very much grateful for your talk, for coming and sharing about the facility, about the online survey and the results. So that's a little thank you for you.